There is a quiet kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone, but from repeatedly standing at the edge of connection and stepping back just before it deepens. It often doesn't look dramatic from the outside. In fact, people who push others away without realizing it are frequently the ones who appear independent, composed, even emotionally self-sufficient. But beneath that surface, there is usually a complicated psychological pattern unfolding, one that is not driven by a lack of desire for closeness, but by a fear of what closeness might demand. At the heart of this behavior is a paradox: the very people who long for connection are often the same ones who unknowingly sabotage it. They may not recognize it in real time. Instead, it shows up subtly, in delayed replies, in emotional withdrawal after moments of intimacy, in suddenly feeling irritated by someone they actually care about, or in convincing themselves that they are better off alone. To them, it feels like self-protection. But psychologically, it is often a learned response to emotional vulnerability that once felt unsafe. This pattern typically has roots that are not obvious in adulthood. It is shaped in quieter moments of emotional development, moments where expressing need was met with inconsistency, where vulnerability was misunderstood, or where emotional closeness came with unpredictability. A child who learns that their emotional world is not always welcomed may grow into an adult who unconsciously believes that needing others is risky. And so, the mind builds defenses that are not consciously chosen but deeply conditioned. One of the most common defenses is emotional distancing. It begins almost invisibly. A conversation starts feeling too personal, too exposed, too real, and something inside pulls away. The person may not say anything outwardly, but internally they begin to disconnect. They shift focus, find flaws in the other person, or suddenly feel overwhelmed by the relationship. This is not because the connection is wrong, but because intimacy itself activates a threat response in the nervous system. The body remembers what the mind has tried to forget. Another form this behavior takes is preemptive rejection. Instead of waiting for the possibility of being hurt, the person creates distance first. They might stop responding as warmly, become less available, or emotionally disengage so that if the relationship fails, it feels like it was their choice. This creates an illusion of control. If I leave first, I cannot be left. If I detach first, I cannot be abandoned. But what feels like control is often just fear wearing a protective mask. In everyday life, this pattern can be confusing both for the person experiencing it and for those around them. A friend may feel increasingly shut out despite no clear conflict. A partner may sense emotional inconsistency, moments of warmth followed by sudden coldness that seems to come out of nowhere. And the person pushing others away often feels misunderstood, even internally conflicted. They may genuinely care about the people they distance themselves from, yet still feel an internal pressure to retreat. What makes this pattern particularly difficult is that it is self-reinforcing. Each time the person withdraws, they temporarily feel safer. The nervous system calms. The emotional intensity drops. But over time, this reinforces the belief that distance equals safety and closeness equals danger. The brain begins to associate intimacy with discomfort, even when the present situation is not actually threatening. So even healthy relationships can start to feel overwhelming. There is also an important emotional layer beneath this: difficulty trusting that one's needs will be met without judgment or rejection. When someone has repeatedly experienced emotional invalidation, whether subtle or overt, they may grow into adulthood with a quiet expectation that others will eventually disappoint them. So rather than waiting for that disappointment, they disengage early. It is not a conscious decision to harm relationships, it is an unconscious attempt to avoid emotional pain. But the cost of this strategy is often invisible at first. On the surface, the person may feel independent, even strong. They may pride themselves on not needing anyone too much. Yet over time, emotional isolation can begin to feel less like freedom and more like emptiness. Human beings are wired for connection, and when that need is repeatedly suppressed, it does not disappear, it turns inward. It can show up as restlessness, chronic dissatisfaction in relationships, or a persistent sense that something is missing, even when life appears stable. Relationships, in this pattern, often follow a familiar cycle. Initial connection feels exciting, even safe for a while. The person may open up, share parts of themselves, and experience genuine closeness. But as emotional intimacy deepens, subtle discomfort begins to rise. They may not identify it as fear, instead, it might be experienced as irritation, boredom, or a sudden sense of pressure. Then comes withdrawal. Conversations become shorter. Emotional availability decreases. Distance grows. And often, once the connection weakens, the longing for closeness returns again, creating a push and pull dynamic that can feel confusing and exhausting. What is important to understand is that this is not a character flaw. It is a protective adaptation. The mind is doing exactly what it learned to do in order to maintain emotional safety. But what once protected a younger version of the self may no longer serve the adult experiencing it. The challenge is not to eliminate the protective instinct, but to understand it. Beneath the withdrawal is often a deeply human fear, the fear of being seen too fully and still not being accepted. For some, intimacy feels like exposure. If someone gets too close, they might see the parts of me I have not fully accepted myself. And if they leave after that, the rejection might feel more personal, more devastating. So instead, distance becomes a way to manage vulnerability by controlling how much of the self is revealed. Yet there is another layer of truth that often goes unnoticed: the very thing being avoided is also what is most deeply desired. People who push others away are rarely indifferent to connection. In many cases, they are highly sensitive to it. They notice small changes in tone, subtle shifts in attention, emotional nuances that others might miss. This sensitivity is not the problem, it is the foundation of their capacity for deep connection. But without emotional safety, that sensitivity becomes overwhelming, leading to withdrawal rather than engagement. In adulthood, this pattern can shape identity in subtle ways. The person may start to believe I am just someone who is better alone, or relationships don't work for me. These beliefs feel rational because they are supported by repeated experience. But underneath them is often an unexamined emotional blueprint that has never been fully questioned. And so the pattern continues, not because it is chosen, but because it feels familiar. Breaking this cycle does not begin with forcing closeness or pushing oneself into uncomfortable vulnerability. It begins with awareness. With noticing the exact moment when the urge to withdraw appears, and instead of immediately acting on it, pausing long enough to ask what emotion is underneath it. Is it fear of being too much? Fear of needing someone? Fear of disappointment? Or simply the discomfort of being emotionally seen? Over time, this awareness creates space between impulse and action. And in that space, something important becomes possible: choice. Instead of automatically retreating, a person can begin to stay present a little longer than before. Not in a forced way, but in a gentle, self-compassionate way that honors the nervous system's need for safety while also gently challenging its old assumptions. Healing this pattern is not about becoming someone who never pulls away. It is about slowly teaching the nervous system that closeness does not always lead to loss, that vulnerability does not always end in rejection, and that being seen does not automatically mean being hurt. These lessons are not learned intellectually, they are learned through repeated emotional experiences that contradict old expectations. And perhaps the most important realization in this process is this: pushing others away was never about not wanting love. It was about not knowing how to stay when love begins to feel real. It was about protection that became overactive. It was about a younger emotional system still trying to prevent old pain from happening again. But adulthood offers something new that childhood did not always provide: choice, awareness, and the ability to rewrite emotional responses slowly and patiently. Change does not require becoming a completely different person. It requires becoming someone who can notice the old pattern without being controlled by it. And in that noticing, something soft begins to happen. Distance becomes less automatic. Connection becomes less threatening. And slowly, almost quietly, the person begins to realize that closeness does not have to mean loss, and that staying present, even when it feels uncomfortable, is sometimes the beginning of the very connection they have been unconsciously searching for all along.